The metal tray hit the polished concrete floor of Camp Pendleton's main mess hall at precisely 6:30 in the morning, sending scrambled eggs and black coffee sprawling across the pristine surface in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. The crash echoed through the cavernous space like a gunshot, sharp and final, cutting through the low rumble of 200 Marines enjoying their breakfast. Captain Sara Mitchell dropped to her knees immediately, her movements fluid and controlled despite the chaos spreading around her boots. At 39 years old, she barely reached 5'3" in her standard issue combat boots. Her blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun, so tight it might have been painted on. She began collecting the scattered pieces of her ruined meal with methodical precision, her hands moving in patterns that spoke of muscle memory built over decades, not years. 200 heads turned almost in unison, conversations dying into an uncomfortable silence that spread through the massive dining facility like ripples across still water. The morning sunlight streaming through the high windows caught the steam rising from overturned coffee, creating ghostly columns in the sudden quiet. A pair of polished combat boots stopped directly in front of Sara's face. The leather gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, recently spit-shined to mirror brightness. She could see her own reflection in them, distorted and small. "You don't belong here." Staff Sergeant Derek Blackwood's voice boomed from above, his 6'2" frame casting a shadow that completely engulfed her smaller form. He was 38, broad-shouldered with the kind of presence that commanded attention even in a room full of Marines. 4 other men slowly rose from their table near the serving line, creating a semicircle that trapped Sara against the wall. Their movements were coordinated, practiced, the body language of pack hunters isolating prey. Sara continued picking up the broken pieces of her tray, her movements slow and deliberate, never once looking up at the men surrounding her. A piece of toast, a plastic fork, the shattered remains of her breakfast plate. Each item went into a small pile she was building, organized by type with the kind of attention to detail that seemed excessive for garbage. "I'm talking to you," Derek growled louder, his voice carrying across the entire mess hall. Every conversation had stopped now. Phones were beginning to appear in hands, held low and subtle, recording what everyone could sense was about to become something more than routine hazing. "Weak women like you only weak in the military, especially those who pretend to be strong." The air conditioning hummed in the background, the only sound breaking the absolute silence that had fallen over the room. Sara stood up slowly, her 5'3" frame barely reaching Derek's shoulder. Her blue eyes looked straight ahead, unblinking and steady, focused on some point beyond his chest. Not submissive, not defiant, simply absent, as if she existed in a different space than the confrontation happening around her. Not one of the 200 people present knew that the woman they were surrounding had just returned 72 hours ago from a deep cover extraction operation in Iran. None of them knew the small bandage hidden beneath her carefully pressed uniform sleeve covered a knife wound from a Russian military advisor. And absolutely nobody knew that in the next 30 seconds, everything they believed about strength would shatter into pieces as broken as her breakfast plate. Near the coffee station, a man in civilian clothes paused in the act of stirring sugar into his cup. Colonel James Harrigan was 72 years old, his hair more silver than gray, his face lined by 7 decades of hard living and harder choices. He wore the simple khakis and polo shirt of a civilian contractor, unremarkable and easily overlooked. But his eyes, pale blue and sharp as winter ice, tracked every movement Sara made with the intensity of a raptor watching prey. Hawk, as everyone called him, had been sipping coffee in military mess halls since before most of the Marines in this room were born. Korea, 1952, the Chosin Reservoir, where he'd learned that the coldest thing in winter wasn't the weather, it was watching good men die. He recognized something in the way Sara held herself, in the economical precision of her movements. It was the kind of awareness that didn't come from peacetime training. It came from places where a wasted motion, meant a wasted life. Derek leaned forward, his face inches from Sarah's, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, mixing with the aggressive cologne he'd applied too liberally that morning. "What's wrong, princess? Cat got your tongue?" Behind him, Corporal Jameson Thorne chuckled, the sound sharp and mean in the quiet space. D.A., as his friends called him, was 29, lean and wiry, with a kind of narrow face that suggested cunning rather than intelligence. Lance Corporal Rhett Sullivan cracked his knuckles audibly, the pops echoing off the walls like small-caliber gunfire. He was 26, built like a middleweight boxer, all compact muscle and coiled aggression. Sergeant Marcus Donovan, built like the college linebacker he used to be, crossed his arms over his broad chest. At 31, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a physical confrontation, his neck thick as a tree trunk, his hands large enough to palm a basketball. Private First Class Wyatt Brennan, the youngest at barely 21, shifted nervously but maintained his position in the circle. Peer pressure overrode the discomfort visible in his eyes, the internal battle playing out in the tension of his jaw. Sarah folded the napkin she'd been using to clean the spill, her movements precise and economical, creating perfect military corners that would have passed the strictest inspection. The motion was so automatic, so ingrained, that it seemed to happen without conscious thought. Across the mess hall, Sergeant Grace Thompson, a 45-year-old Marine with 20 years of service etched into the lines around her eyes, found herself leaning forward slightly. There was something about the way this small woman moved, something that triggered recognition in the deepest parts of Grace's combat-trained mind. Derek's patience was wearing thin. His face reddened as Sarah continued to ignore him, methodically cleaning the mess as if 5 large Marines weren't surrounding her with obvious hostile intent. The lack of response was more infuriating than any comeback would have been. It suggested she didn't consider them worth acknowledging. "Listen here, you little." He reached out and shoved her shoulder, not hard enough to knock her down, but with enough force to make his point clear. To establish dominance. To put her in her place. Sarah's body absorbed the impact without moving, her muscles tensed in a way that spoke of years of training, the kind that turns reaction into reflex, though she made no aggressive movement in response. Her boots stayed planted exactly where they were, her center of gravity low and stable. Physics suggested she should have stumbled. She didn't. Hawk set his coffee down slowly, the ceramic cup meeting the counter without a sound. His calloused hand remained on the handle, but his body had shifted, weight moving forward onto the balls of his feet. It was the posture of a man preparing to move, though he remained perfectly still. Waiting. Watching. "Maybe she's deaf," Jamie suggested with a nasty laugh, moving closer and deliberately invading her personal space in a way designed to intimidate. "Or just too stupid to understand English." Sarah's eyes tracked to the 6 exits in the mess hall, cataloging distances and obstacles in less than 2 seconds. Northeast door, 47 feet, 4 occupied tables between. Southwest door, 32 feet, clear path but narrow choke point. Emergency exit, 60 feet, alarmed. The calculation was so fast and practiced that her gaze never seemed to leave the floor, never seemed to assess anything at all. But her breathing remained steady, controlled in a way that combat veterans would recognize as someone preparing for action while maintaining the appearance of calm. The morning sun climbed higher outside, its light shifting from golden to harsh white. Somewhere in the kitchen, dishes clattered. A serving tray scraped against metal. Normal sounds of a military breakfast, overlaid on a confrontation that was rapidly approaching a point of no return. Derek's hand shot out again, this time grabbing for Sarah's arm, intending to spin her around and force her to acknowledge him. His fingers closed on fabric and found only air. She had shifted, minutely, her body sliding sideways with a kind of precision that suggested the movement had been practiced 10,000 times, maybe more. "Don't you walk away from me," Derek snarled, his embarrassment fueling his anger into something darker, more dangerous. The entire mess hall was watching now, phones held higher, no longer trying to hide what they were recording. Several Marines sensed this confrontation was escalating beyond normal military hazing, beyond the rough humor that defined warrior culture. This was heading somewhere that would have consequences. Sara turned back to face her harassers, her movements unhurried. For the first time she spoke, her voice so quiet that people had to strain to hear it. The words emerged soft as falling snow, but with an undertone like steel cable wrapped in silk. "May I leave, Staff Sergeant?" The question was perfectly respectful, following exact military protocol. But something in her tone made Grace Thompson sit up straighter. There was steel under that soft voice, the kind that came from absolute confidence rather than mere training. It was the voice of someone asking permission as a courtesy, not because they needed it. "May I leave?" Marcus mocked in a high-pitched voice, drawing laughs from Jamie and Red. Listen to her trying to sound all proper. Bet she memorized the whole manual because she knew she'd need to hide behind regulations. The insult was designed to sting, to provoke a response that would justify escalating their harassment. It was a tactic as old as military service itself. Push someone until they snapped, then claim they were unstable or unfit for duty. The trap had been set. They were waiting for her to step into it. Hawk's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. His fingers drummed once against the coffee cup, then stilled. Still, he didn't move, didn't intervene, but his eyes never left Sara's face, reading something there that the younger Marines couldn't see. "You know what?" Marcus stepped forward, his former athlete's confidence radiating from every movement. At 6'1" and 230 pounds of muscle, he was used to physical intimidation working in his favor. "I bet you don't even know how to field strip a weapon. They probably gave you a desk job because you couldn't handle real military training." He pulled out his phone and set it to timer mode, the screen glowing in his palm. "Tell you what, Princess, there's an M4 in the training room next door. If you can field strip it in under 15 seconds, we'll leave you alone. Hell, we'll even apologize." His grin was sharp and mean. "But when you fail, you admit you don't belong here and request a transfer to something more suitable, like the kitchen staff." The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Every Marine in the room knew that 15 seconds was the standard for field stripping an M4 carbine. It was a respectable time that most infantry Marines could achieve with practice, the kind of muscle memory that came from doing something hundreds of times until your hands knew the movements better than your brain. What they didn't know was that Sara Mitchell had once field stripped an M4 in complete darkness while under enemy fire in Raqqa, reassembling it in time to eliminate 3 hostiles who had been advancing on a wounded Marine's position. What they didn't know was that she could do it blindfolded, one-handed, or in any of a dozen other configurations that training manuals didn't cover. What they didn't know was that in her world, 15 seconds wasn't a challenge. It was an eternity. Sara's head tilted slightly, a motion so small it was almost imperceptible. Her eyes met Marcus's for the first time, and something flickered in their blue depths. Not anger, not fear, something colder and far more dangerous. Calculation. "If that's what it takes for you to leave me alone," she said quietly. The words were carefully chosen. Not an acceptance of his premise that she didn't belong, just an acknowledgement of what would end this confrontation. The difference was subtle but significant. Grace Thompson found herself standing up, her veteran's instincts screaming that something significant was about to happen. She'd seen enough combat to recognize the signs. Sara wasn't preparing to fail. She was preparing to destroy their assumptions so thoroughly that they'd never recover. The group moved toward the adjacent training room, drawing a crowd of curious Marines who sensed drama unfolding. The room contained several training weapons, properly secured but accessible for supervised practice. Marcus grabbed an M4 from the rack, checking that it was unloaded with the exaggerated care of someone making a show of safety. He slammed it down on the table with unnecessary force. The metal on wood impact sharp as a slab. "Clock starts when you touch it," he announced, his phone ready to time her failure. Around them, Marines crowded closer, some standing on chairs for a better view. The air was electric with anticipation. Sara approached the weapon with the same calm she'd shown throughout the confrontation. No hesitation, no showboating. She simply walked to the table and let her hands hover over the rifle for a moment, like a pianist preparing to play a familiar piece. Then she moved. The watching Marines had expected fumbling, maybe hesitation, perhaps some basic competence if she'd paid attention during training. What they saw instead was something entirely different, something that belonged in a different category of human capability. Her hands became a blur of precise motion, each movement flowing into the next with a fluidity that spoke of countless hours of practice under conditions far more stressful than a training room. The trigger assembly separated from the lower receiver before most people had processed that she'd started. The bolt carrier group was out and placed precisely on the table, while Marines were still blinking in surprise. The barrel and handguard separated from the upper receiver with a smooth motion that looked almost gentle despite its speed. Every piece was laid out in perfect order, ready for inspection or reassembly. The spacing was exact, the arrangement textbook perfect, and Sara's hands were already reaching for the first component to put it back together. The timer on Marcus's phone read 4.3 seconds when she began reassembly. By 6.8 seconds, the weapon was completely reassembled, every component in its proper place. By 8 seconds, she had performed a functions check and set the weapon back on the table with the same calm precision she'd shown throughout. The room was absolutely silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the base waking up for the morning's activities. 200 pairs of eyes stared at the rifle, then at Sara, then back at the rifle, as if the weapon itself might offer an explanation for what they just witnessed. "Holy hell," someone whispered from the back of the crowd, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "That's not just good, that's special forces level." The comment rippled through the watching Marines like an electric current. Heads turned toward each other, confirming what they'd seen, making sure their eyes hadn't deceived them. Marcus stared at his phone as if it had betrayed him, the numbers refusing to change no matter how hard he looked at them. 8 seconds total. Nearly half the time he'd challenged her to meet. More than half the time most of them could achieve. Derek's face had shifted from rage to something closer to confusion, the red draining to an unhealthy pallor. The veins in his neck stood out like cables under stress. "So you can play with weapons. Big deal." His voice was too loud, compensating for the weakness of his argument. "Probably spent all your time practicing instead of doing real military work." The accusation was weak, and everyone knew it. The level of muscle memory Sara had just displayed didn't come from practicing in safe conditions. It came from living with your weapon, from depending on it for survival, from knowing that the difference between 8 seconds and 15 seconds might be the difference between life and death. It came from places where fumbling a reassembly meant you didn't get to try again. Colonel Daniel Harper had moved closer during the demonstration, his experienced eye cataloging details that the younger Marines might miss. The way Sara's stance had shifted when she touched the weapon, moving from passive to perfectly balanced for combat. The slight wear patterns on her hands that came from thousands of hours of weapons handling. The small scar on her left palm that looked suspiciously like a defensive wound from a knife fight. He pulled out his phone and began typing a query into a secure database, his suspicions growing with each passing second. Hawk Harrigan stood near the door, his lined face unreadable, but his eyes were bright with something that might have been recognition, or vindication, or perhaps just the satisfaction of seeing his initial assessment confirmed. He'd known what she was the moment she folded that napkin. Every movement since had simply added more evidence to support his conclusion. "Anyone can learn tricks," Jamie said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The swagger had drained from his posture like water from a cracked vessel. "Doesn't mean she belongs in combat arms. Probably never even seen real action." The comment was meant to salvage some dignity from the situation, to reframe the demonstration as meaningless in the larger context of military capability. But it rang hollow after what they just witnessed. Several Marines in the crowd were already pulling out their phones, not to record, but to text friends about what they'd just seen. The story would be all over the base within an hour, growing and changing with each retelling, but the core truth would remain. Something extraordinary had just happened. Sara turned to leave again, maintaining her strategy of minimal engagement. She'd answered their challenge, met their terms. Now she was done. But Derek moved to block her path, his body language shifting from aggressive to something darker, more dangerous. The embarrassment had transformed into genuine rage, the kind that made men do stupid things. "We're not done here," he growled, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Just because you can perform some tricks doesn't mean anything. You still don't belong here. Women make the military weak, and you're proof of that. Hiding behind regulations and putting on little shows instead of being real warriors." The insult was calculated to wound, aimed at every female service member who had ever been told they were diversity hires or quota fillers, rather than legitimate warriors. Around the room, several female Marines bristled, including a lance corporal named Ember Reeves, a 24-year-old with auburn hair and green eyes that were currently narrowed in anger. She started to step forward, ready to intervene, but Grace Thompson caught her eye and shook her head slightly. Something was about to happen. And Grace's instincts, honed over 2 decades of service, told her to wait. Sara's eyes remained fixed on some point past Derek's shoulder, her breathing steady and controlled. "Staff Sergeant, I've complied with your challenge. I'm requesting permission to return to my duties." Her voice remained professionally neutral, but there was something underneath it now, a quality that made the hair on the back of Harper's neck stand up. He'd heard that tone before, in places where calm professionalism was all that stood between mission success and catastrophic failure. It was the voice of someone operating on a different level, playing a different game than everyone else in the room. "Duties?" Derek laughed, the sound harsh and mocking, echoing off the concrete walls. "What duties could you possibly have that matter? Counting supplies? Filing reports? That's all you're good for. That's all any of you are good for." He gestured dismissively at the female Marines in the crowd, his contempt clear as broken glass. "The military was stronger before we started pretending everyone was equal. Before we lowered standards to let people like you play soldier." The silence that followed Derek's words was deafening. Even his friends looked uncomfortable now, shifting their weight from foot to foot, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The naked prejudice of his statement hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Wyatt Brennan took a small step back, physically distancing himself from the group, his discomfort finally overwhelming his need to fit in. His face had gone pale, his jaw tight with the realization of what line they'd just crossed. Several senior NCOs in the crowd were already making mental notes about the incident, knowing that Derek had just crossed a line that would have serious consequences, regardless of how this ended. Master Chief Patricia Callahan, a 48-year-old woman who'd been a Marine longer than some of these men had been alive, had her phone out and was recording every word. Her expression suggested she was looking forward to the paperwork this was going to generate. Sara's response was unexpected. She pulled out her phone, an ordinary-looking device that was anything but ordinary. The screen lit up at her touch, displaying information that made her eyes narrow slightly. Her posture shifted, subtle but significant. Something had changed. Some calculation had been completed, some decision made. "Staff Sergeant Blackwood," she said, using his full name and rank for the first time. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the room with perfect clarity. You should know that Corporal Rachel Blackwood of 2nd Battalion is an excellent Marine. Your cousin, I believe. She served with distinction in Helmand Province." Derek froze. The color drained from his face as if someone had opened a valve. "How do you—" he started, then stopped. The question of how this supposed nobody knew about his family connections to other units was more than unsettling. It was impossible. His cousin Rachel was indeed with 2nd Battalion, and she had indeed served in Helmand, but that information wasn't common knowledge. It certainly wasn't something a random logistics clerk should know. "I've read her file," Sara continued, her voice still quiet but carrying easily through the silent room. Every word landed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Outstanding marksmanship scores. Excellent leadership potential, according to her commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Winters. She represents the best of what female Marines can be. It's unfortunate that you don't share her perspective on women in the military. The statement was delivered without emotion, just a presentation of facts. But it landed like a precision strike. Derek's mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging. How did she know his CO's name? How did she know Rachel's evaluation details? That was classified information, available only to those with need-to-know access. Access that a petty officer 3rd class in logistics should definitely not have. Jamie, trying to salvage the situation and support his friend, made a crucial mistake. He reached out and grabbed Sarah's shoulder, spinning her around to face him. His grip was tight, fingers digging into her uniform. "Don't you dare talk about things you don't understand, you little—" The rest of his sentence was lost in what happened next. Sarah's body moved with the fluid grace of water finding its path downhill, using Jamie's own force against him. Her hand came up and deflected his grip with a motion so economical, it barely seemed to happen. In the same flowing movement, she somehow guided him into an off-balance position that sent him stumbling backward into red. It wasn't violent. It wasn't even particularly forceful. It was simply perfect technique, applied with an economy of motion that spoke of years of training in close-quarters combat. Jamie windmilled his arms, trying to regain his balance, and ended up grabbing Rhett's shirt for support. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs, cursing and trying to separate themselves while maintaining some dignity. The move had taken less than 2 seconds, and Sara had barely seemed to move at all. Grace Thompson was on her feet now, her trained eye recognizing what she'd just seen. That wasn't basic self-defense taught in boot camp. That wasn't even advanced military combatives taught to infantry Marines. That was something else entirely, something taught in very specific places to very specific people. She pulled out her own phone and sent a quick message to someone she knew in intelligence, her suspicions crystallizing into near certainty. Hawk's lips curved into the smallest of smiles, there and gone in an instant. He'd seen that technique before. 1984, Fort Bragg, watching Delta Force operators train. He'd been a guest instructor, sharing lessons learned from Korea about operating behind enemy lines. The technique Sara had just used was from that playbook. The question was no longer whether she was special operations. The question was which unit and how deep did her cover go. Derek's control finally snapped. The accumulation of embarrassments, the field stripping, the knowledge about his cousin, and now his friends being made to look foolish, pushed him past the point of rational thought. His face twisted with rage, all pretense of discipline abandoned. He lunged forward, his hand reaching for Sara's collar, intending to grab her and shake some respect into her. It was assault, plain and simple, and everyone watching knew it. Several phones came up higher, recording what they assumed would be evidence for the court-martial that would surely follow. Master Chief Callahan's finger tightened on her record button, her expression grim. This had gone from harassment to criminal assault in the space of a heartbeat. But Sara moved, not away from the attack, but into it. Her body slid past Derek's grasp like smoke through fingers, her feet repositioning with the kind of precision that came from 10,000 hours of practice, maybe 100,000. Her hand came up and made contact with his wrist, a touch so light it looked gentle, almost tender. But Derek's forward momentum suddenly redirected sideways, his feet tangling beneath him as if the floor had suddenly tilted. His balance completely destroyed by that feather-light deflection. He crashed into a table with enough force to knock over several chairs. The noise was tremendous in the quiet room, metal scraping against concrete in a cacophony that made several people wince. A water bottle rolled across the floor, coming to rest against someone's boot. Derek scrambled to his feet, his expression now blank with shock rather than rage. His hands were shaking, though whether from adrenaline or fury was impossible to tell. "You little—" He charged again, this time with his fist pulled back, ready to throw a punch that would end this confrontation decisively. The watching Marines gasped, knowing that striking another service member would mean the end of Derek's career. But he was beyond caring now, beyond thinking. All that mattered was putting this woman in her place, restoring the natural order that she had so thoroughly disrupted. His fist drove forward with all the power his 6'2" frame could generate, aimed directly at Sara's face. The impact would have broken bones, maybe worse. It was a punch thrown with intent to harm, crossing every line that separated discipline from assault. The impact never came. Sara shifted minutely, and Derek's fist passed so close to her cheek that it stirred the few loose strands of her blonde hair. In the same motion, her hand came up and made contact with specific points on Derek's extended arm. To observers, it looked like she barely touched him, her fingers pressing lightly against his forearm for less than a second. But Derek's entire body went rigid for a moment before his arm dropped uselessly to his side, hanging limp as a dead branch. He staggered backward, his arm completely unresponsive, his eyes wide with shock and something that looked very much like fear. He tried to raise the arm, his shoulder muscles bunching with effort, but nothing happened. The limb might as well have belonged to someone else for all the control he had over it. "That's a nerve strike," Grace announced to the room, her voice cutting through the shocked silence like a blade. Her 20 years of experience gave weight to her words, authority to her assessment. "Delta Force teaches that. Navy SEALs teach that." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "But they sure as hell don't teach that in basic training." All eyes turned to Sara, who stood exactly where she'd been, not even breathing hard despite having just disabled a man nearly twice her size without apparent effort. Her uniform was still perfectly pressed, her hair still in its tight bun. She might have been standing in formation for all the exertion she showed. The only sign that anything had happened was the slight adjustment of her stance, weight balanced perfectly between both feet, ready to move in any direction. The morning sun had fully risen now, pouring through the windows in shafts of white light that caught the dust motes stirred up by the brief violence. Somewhere outside, a flag snapped in the breeze. A truck engine rumbled past. Normal sounds of a military base going about its business, completely disconnected from the moment of revelation happening in this training room. Colonel Harper's phone buzzed with a response to his database query. He looked at the screen and his face went pale, the color draining away as he read the information displayed there. The record for Petty Officer 3rd Class Sara Martin showed standard logistics training. Nothing unusual, nothing that would explain what he just witnessed. But there was a flag on the file, a small notation that most people wouldn't notice or understand. It indicated that this record had been sanitized, that the real service record was classified at a level so high that even Harper's considerable clearance couldn't access it. Only one type of service member had records that classified, those involved in special access programs. Black operations that officially didn't exist. Operators who worked in the darkest corners of America's war on terror, doing things that would never be acknowledged, saving lives that would never be counted. "Everyone back away," Harper commanded, his voice carrying the authority of rank and the urgency of someone who suddenly realized they were dealing with something far beyond a simple mess hall confrontation. Staff Sergeant Blackwood, Corporal Thorne, Lance Corporal Sullivan, Sergeant Donovan, Private First Class Brennan, you five stay exactly where you are. Everyone else return to your duties, now. The crowd began to disperse, though reluctantly. Everyone could sense that something significant had happened, though most weren't quite sure what. Phones were already buzzing with texts, the story spreading across the base like wildfire. Within minutes, it would reach every corner of Camp Pendleton, growing and changing with each retelling, but the core truth remaining intact. Something extraordinary had just occurred in the training room, something that would be discussed for months, maybe years to come. Hawk Harrigan remained where he was, his civilian status giving him latitude that the Marines didn't have. His eyes met Sara's across the room, and something passed between them. Recognition, acknowledgement, the silent communication of two warriors who understood things that couldn't be spoken aloud. The door to the training room opened, and Admiral William Sutherland walked in. At 62 years old, he wore his service dress blues with the kind of ease that came from a lifetime in uniform. The ribbons on his chest told a story of 30 years of distinguished service, from the first Gulf War to the present day. Commander of Naval Operations for the Pacific Fleet, a man whose presence anywhere meant something significant was happening. Every Marine in the room snapped to attention instantly, back straight, eyes forward. Even Derek, cradling his still useless arm, managed to straighten up. "At ease," the Admiral said, though his tone suggested anything but ease. His eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who had seen plenty of confrontations in his career. His gaze lingered on Sara for a moment, something flickering in his expression that might have been recognition or perhaps resignation. "Colonel Harper," he said without preamble, "report." Harper quickly summarized the morning's events, professional and concise despite his own uncertainty about what exactly had transpired. The mess hall confrontation, the weapon field stripping, the physical assault, the nerve strike that had disabled Blackwood's arm. The Admiral listened without interruption, though his jaw tightened noticeably when Harper described Derek's comments about women in the military in his attempted assault. When Harper finished, the Admiral turned to Sara, who remained at attention despite his earlier command to be at ease. She stood perfectly still, her blue eyes focused on some middle distance, her breathing steady and controlled. Waiting. "Petty Officer Martin," the Admiral said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone lean in slightly. He paused, and the silence stretched out like a wire pulled taut. Or should I say, Captain Sara Mitchell. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt, the shock wave rippling through every person present. Captain. 06. A rank that took most officers 15 to 20 years to achieve. It was impossible for someone who appeared to be in her 30s to hold that rank unless she had been commissioned under special circumstances. Unless she had been fast-tracked through programs reserved for exceptional personnel. Unless she was something far beyond what her cover identity suggested. Derek actually staggered backward a step, his good hand coming up to his chest as if he'd been punched. That's impossible," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's listed as a petty officer, 3rd class. She's just logistics." His voice trailed off as the implications sank in, each realization hitting like a physical blow. If Sara was actually a captain operating under a cover identity, then she wasn't just special forces. She was something beyond that, something that required the kind of deep cover that only the most classified operations demanded. Operations that couldn't be acknowledged. Missions that officially never happened. The Admiral's next words shattered what remained of everyone's assumptions, dropping truth like bombs that left craters in their understanding of reality. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the finality of judgment, "you've just had the privilege of witnessing a demonstration by one of the Navy's most decorated special operators. Captain Sara Mitchell, Delta Force, attached to Task Force Orange. 47 confirmed combat missions across Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Iran, including operations that I'm not at liberty to discuss, even in this setting. He let that sink in for a moment, watching the color drain from 5 faces as the magnitude of their mistake crashed over them like a tsunami. 72 hours ago, Captain Mitchell single-handedly infiltrated an Iranian Revolutionary Guard compound near Kermanshah and extracted 4 captured Army Rangers under heavy fire. 0 American casualties. The Iranian government is still trying to figure out what happened. The admiral's voice hardened, taking on the edge of command authority that had sent men into battle for 3 decades. And this morning, U-5 surrounded her, harassed her, and ultimately assaulted a superior officer who was maintaining deep cover for reasons classified well above any of your clearances. The training room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop on carpet. Derek's face had gone from shock to something approaching horror, the blood draining away as the full magnitude of what he'd done crashed over him. He had just attempted to assault someone who outranked him by several pay grades. Someone who was apparently one of the Navy's elite warriors. Someone who could have killed him with her bare hands, but had chosen to simply disable him instead. Sara remained silent throughout the Admiral's revelation, neither confirming nor denying his words. Her expression hadn't changed, maintaining the same calm professionalism she'd shown while being harassed and attacked. It was the expression of someone who had faced far worse than angry Marines and survived things that most people couldn't imagine. The face of someone who operated in a world where today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally, where nothing was simple and everything was classified. Admiral Sutherland turned to the military police who had appeared at the door. These 5 are to be detained pending a full investigation. Charges will include conduct unbecoming, assault, harassment, and violation of equal opportunity policies. His eyes fixed on Derek like targeting lasers. Staff Sergeant Blackwood will face additional charges for striking a superior officer. The MPs moved forward, beginning to read the 5 Marines their rights. Derek looked like his world was ending, which in many ways it was. A court-martial for these charges would almost certainly end his military career. Everything he'd worked for, destroyed in one morning of prejudice and stupidity. But then Sara spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. "Admiral Sutherland, sir, permission to speak freely?" The Admiral nodded, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Every person in the room held their breath, waiting to hear what this ghost warrior would say. Sara turned to face the 5 detained Marines, her blue eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "These men made a serious error in judgment," she said quietly. "But I don't believe it was malicious. It was ignorance." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "With your permission, sir, I'd like to recommend remedial training rather than court-martial. They can learn from this and become better Marines. Or we can end their careers here. I believe in redemption through education." The room was silent for a long moment. Derek stared at Sara in complete shock, his mouth hanging open. She had every right to see him buried under the uniform code of military justice. Every right to end his career in disgrace, to make him pay for every insult, every threat, every moment of humiliation. But instead, she was advocating for mercy. For a second chance he absolutely didn't deserve. It was a gesture so unexpected, so at odds with what he would have done in her place, that he couldn't process it. His brain refused to accept this reality, where the person he'd attacked was now saving him. Admiral Sutherland studied Sara for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly, respect evident in the gesture. "Your recommendation will be taken into consideration, Captain. However, there will be consequences." He turned back to the 5 Marines, his voice hard as iron. "You 5 will face non-judicial punishment, reduction in rank for Staff Sergeant Blackwood, mandatory participation in a year-long equality and respect program. You will also provide written apologies to every female service member on this base. He paused, his gaze boring into each of them. Consider yourselves fortunate that Captain Mitchell has more grace than you showed her, more honor than you demonstrated, and more wisdom than you possess. Dismissed. As the MPS began to lead the 5 Marines away, Hawk Harrigan approached Sara quietly. His craggy face carried an expression that might have been approval, or satisfaction, or perhaps just the acknowledgement of one warrior recognizing another. "I knew the moment you folded that napkin," he said softly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Korea taught me to recognize warriors, not by what they say or how they look, but by how they move, how they exist in space." He paused, his pale blue eyes meeting hers. "Welcome home, Captain Mitchell." Sara's lips curved into the smallest of smiles, there and gone like morning mist. "Thank you, Colonel. Though I believe my cover is somewhat compromised now." Hawk's quiet laugh was like gravel shifting. "Cover's overrated anyway. Sometimes the best thing you can do is show people what real strength looks like. Let them learn. Let them grow." He glanced toward where the 5 Marines were being escorted out. "You just taught 200 people more about courage and capability than 1,000 PowerPoint presentations ever could." Admiral Sutherland approached them both, his expression softening slightly now that the official business was concluded. "Captain Mitchell, Colonel Harrigan, my office. We need to discuss what happens next." As they walked toward the door, Sara paused and looked back at the training room one last time. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the space where everything had changed, where 5 men had learned that strength came in forms they never expected, where 200 Marines had witnessed something that would reshape how they thought about capability and character. The M4 carbine still sat on the table where she'd placed it, perfectly assembled, waiting for the next person to use it. Outside, Camp Pendleton was waking fully to the new day, completely unaware that in one small training room, a truth had been revealed that would ripple outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water. The story would spread, the lessons would take root, and nothing would quite be the same again. The Admiral's office overlooked the Pacific Ocean, floor-to-ceiling windows framing an expanse of blue water that stretched to the horizon. Admiral Sutherland closed the door behind them with a quiet click that seemed to seal the room from the rest of the world. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and white, but inside this space the light felt different, heavier, like walking into a confessional. Sara stood at parade rest, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture perfect despite the morning's confrontation. Hawk Harrigan settled into one of the leather chairs with the careful movements of a man whose joints remembered every hard landing, every cold night, every year of service. At 72, he'd earned the right to sit when offered. "At ease, Captain," Sutherland said, moving behind his desk but not sitting. He looked at Sara with an expression that mixed respect and something that might have been paternal concern. "Or should I continue calling you Petty Officer Martin, given the circumstances?" "That cover is burned, sir," Sara replied, her voice steady. "The entire base will know within the hour. Probably already does." Sutherland nodded, unsurprised. "Your counterintelligence operation, the 3 contractors selling classified information. Give me the summary." Sara's recitation was clinical, precise. Thomas Brennan, civilian IT contractor. David Walsh, facilities management. Jennifer Sullivan, communications specialist. They've been passing technical specifications on our new satellite communication systems to Chinese intelligence for the past 8 months. Digital forensics traced the data to an encrypted server in Macau. We arrested them at 0600 this morning. NCIS has them in custody now. "The harassment in the mess hall," Hawk said quietly from his chair, his weathered fingers steepled under his chin. "That wasn't coincidence, was it?" Sara's lips curved slightly. "Brennan was watching, sent a message to his handler about a situation developing. That communication allowed us to complete the trace. Staff Sergeant Blackwood's actions, misguided as they were, actually accelerated the investigation's conclusion. So his prejudice served a purpose, Sutherland said, something like irony in his voice. Though I doubt he'll find much comfort in that. He finally sat, leaning back in his chair. Colonel Harrigan, you recognize Captain Mitchell immediately. Care to explain how? Hawk's pale blue eyes shifted to Sara, then back to the Admiral. Korea, 1952. Chosin Reservoir. When you've seen enough combat, you learn to recognize the signs. It's not about size or gender. It's about how someone moves through space, how they assess threats, how they fold a napkin. He paused. Captain Mitchell folds corners like a Delta operator preparing a drop zone marker. Precise, automatic, the kind of muscle memory that comes from doing something in the dark while people are shooting at you. You trained with Delta in the 80s, Sutherland said. It wasn't a question. Fort Bragg, 1984. I was teaching survival techniques from Korea. They were teaching me how modern special operations worked. Hawk's gaze returned to Sara. The nerve strike you used on Blackwood, that's from the original Delta Combatives manual. Pressure point 2 inches below the clavicle, 45-degree angle, disrupts the brachial plexus. Temporary paralysis, no permanent damage. They stopped teaching that variation in 1989, switched to different techniques. I learned from an instructor who preferred the old methods, Sara said quietly. Said they were more reliable under stress. Your father, Hawk said, and the room went very still. Sara's mask slipped for just a moment, surprise flickering across her features before she controlled it. You knew my father? Hawk stood slowly, moving to the window. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, making him look like something carved from weathered stone. Captain John Mitchell, Delta Force. We served together on a black operation west of Baghdad during Desert Storm, January 1991. He turned to face her, and his eyes carried the weight of 33 years of memory. He saved my life. Sara's breathing had changed, subtle but noticeable. Her hands, clasped behind her back, tightened until the knuckles went white. I was 6 when he died. They told my mother it was a helicopter accident. Training exercise gone wrong. I never knew the real story. The real story is still classified, Sutherland said gently. But Colonel Harrigan was there, and I think it's time you knew the truth about your father's last mission. Hawk returned to his chair, settling in as if the weight of the story required him to be grounded. January 27th, 1991, third day of the ground war. An F-15E Strike Eagle was shot down by Iraqi anti-aircraft fire 40 kilometers west of Baghdad. The pilot ejected successfully, so did the weapons systems officer. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The WSO was Captain Jennifer Hayes, one of the first female combat pilots in Air Force history. Sara's eyes widened slightly. The only sign that this information was landing like artillery shells. Command wanted to abort the rescue, Hawk continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting from memory. Iraqi Republican Guard units were converging on the crash site. The risk was assessed as too high, but your father said something I'll never forget. Hawk's voice dropped to almost a whisper. He said, "We don't leave anyone behind. Male or female, they're Americans, they're ours, and we're going." The office was silent except for the distant sound of waves against the shore. Sara stood perfectly still, but something in her posture had changed. She was no longer a captain receiving a briefing. She was a daughter learning about her father for the first time. We went in with a 4-man team, Hawk said. Your father, myself, and 2 other operators whose names are still classified. We reached Hayes first. She had a broken leg from the ejection, but she was alive and fighting, had already killed 2 Iraqi soldiers with her sidearm. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Your father said she reminded him of his daughter, said you had the same fire in your eyes. Sara's breath caught audibly. He said that? He talked about you constantly, Hawk replied. Showed everyone pictures. 6 years old and already climbing trees like a monkey, he said. already fearless. The smile faded. We got Hayes secured and started moving toward the extraction point. But an entire Republican Guard company had surrounded the area. 80-plus soldiers with armor support. Sutherland spoke quietly. What happened next is classified at the highest levels. But what I can tell you is that your father held a defensive position alone for 17 minutes, while Colonel Harrigan got Captain Hayes to the extraction helicopter. 17 minutes, Hawk said, his voice rough with old grief. I told him to fall back. Told him we'd find another way. He said, "Get her home, Hawk." That's an order. So I did. He met Sarah's eyes. When we came back with reinforcements, we found him. He'd eliminated 23 Iraqi soldiers, held that position until he ran out of ammunition. Then he used his knife, then his hands. The old Marine's voice broke slightly. He took 11 rounds. Any one of them would have been fatal eventually, but he kept fighting until Captain Hayes was across the border, until his mission was complete. They found him with an Iraqi officer's sidearm in his hand, empty. He'd used every bullet. Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. The last words, the radio transmission, "Tell my daughter to be strong, be silent, be deadly." That was real? I was on that radio, Hawk said. Those were his exact words. I've carried them for 33 years, waiting for the day I could deliver them to you directly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. He also asked me to give you this if I ever got the chance. It's his field journal, personal thoughts, not classified operations. Things he wanted you to know about him, about why he did what he did. Sarah took the notebook with trembling hands, the first sign of vulnerability she'd shown all morning. The leather was worn soft with age and handling, the pages yellowed but intact. She opened it to a random page and saw her father's handwriting, neat and precise. Her fingers traced the letters like reading Braille. Captain Hayes survived, Sutherland said. Went on to become the first female squadron commander in Air Force history. Retired as a brigadier general. She's spoken at the Air Force Academy every year for the past 2 decades, telling a story about an Army Delta operator who sacrificed everything to prove that capability has no gender. She doesn't use your father's name because it's still classified, but she makes sure every cadet knows that real warriors judge people by their actions, not their appearance. Sarah closed the notebook carefully, holding it against her chest like a precious artifact. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion she could no longer completely hide. My call sign, silent. I chose it because of his last words. I never knew there was more to the story. There's always more to the story, Hawk said gently. Your father died proving what you demonstrated this morning. That strength isn't about size or gender. It's about courage, skill, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for those who can't protect themselves. You inherited more than his skill, Captain. You inherited his values. The moment stretched out, heavy with the weight of revelation and remembered grief. Then Sarah straightened, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand in a gesture that was more soldier than officer. Permission to ask a question, sir? Granted, Sutherland said. The 5 Marines, Blackwood and the others. You said my recommendation for rehabilitation would be considered. What's the actual outcome? Sutherland pulled a file from his desk. Staff Sergeant Blackwood reduced to sergeant. 1 year of remedial equality training. In today to speak at no fewer than 12 events about his experience and transformation. Written apologies to every female service member on this installation. He looked up. The same applies to the other 4, adjusted for rank. It's the most lenient punishment I could justify, given the severity of their actions. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me, Captain. Thank yourself. You showed them mercy they didn't deserve. Now they have the chance to become better men than they were. Whether they take that chance is up to them. 3 days later, Derek Blackwood sat in a holding cell at Camp Pendleton's military police station, staring at the cinder block wall across from him. His arm had regained feeling after about 40 minutes, the temporary paralysis wearing off exactly as designed. But the humiliation remained. The shame burned like acid in his gut. They'd given him one phone call. He thought about calling his parents, his girlfriend, a lawyer. Instead, he found himself dialing a number he hadn't used in 6 months. Rachel? His voice came out rougher than he intended. It's Derek. I need to talk to you about something. About women in the military. About a lot of things I've been wrong about. The conversation that followed was painful. His cousin Samantha, everyone called her Rachel, listened as Derek recounted the morning's events, his voice breaking when he described attacking someone who had shown him nothing but professional courtesy despite his harassment. When he finished, Rachel was quiet for a long moment before speaking. You know, Derek, I never told you about Kandahar because I knew how you'd react. Her voice carried disappointment, but also a weary familiarity. You would have dismissed it, said I was exaggerating, or worse, that I was taking credit for something the men in my unit did. You've been telling me I don't belong in the Corps since the day I enlisted. Rachel, let me finish. Her voice hardened. August 2011. Convoy ambush outside Kandahar. Taliban hit us with RPGs and small arms fire. My vehicle was disabled. 3 wounded Marines, including my driver. The rest of the convoy had to push forward. They couldn't stop or the whole unit would be massacred. So I stayed. Derek could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, the memories clearly still sharp. I held that position alone for 35 minutes while medevac was arranged, killed 14 Taliban fighters who tried to flank our position, kept 3 Marines alive who would have bled out without suppressing fire. They recommended me for a Silver Star. She paused. But here's the part I never told you. The part I didn't know myself until years later. What part? There was a sniper providing overwatch during my stand. Unknown operator. Killed 6 Taliban fighters who were flanking my position from the east. I never saw them. Never knew they were there until after-action reports mentioned the bodies. Rachel's voice dropped. I've wondered for years who that sniper was. What unit? Why they were there. Derek felt ice forming in his stomach. It was her, wasn't it? Captain Mitchell. I don't know for certain. Those operations are classified. But after what you've told me, after learning she knew details about my engagement that aren't in any public record? Rachel's voice carried certainty. Yeah, I think it was her. I think the woman you attacked saved my life. Derek's hands started shaking. He pressed the phone tighter to his ear. Rachel, I'm sorry. For everything I said, everything I believed, I was wrong. Yes, you were. The question is what you're going to do about it now. Before Derek could answer, Master Chief Patricia Callahan appeared at his cell with a tablet in hand. Blackwood, you've got a visitor, and I'm going to show you something first. She held up the tablet. On the screen was surveillance footage from Syria, grainy but clear enough. The timestamp read 2018. A marketplace, civilians running in panic as explosions rocked the area. In the chaos, a figure in local clothing moved against the tide of fleeing people, heading toward the danger. The figure reached a group of wounded Marines pinned down by sniper fire. What happened next made Derek's breath catch in his throat. The person produced a rifle from beneath flowing robes and proceeded to eliminate multiple threat positions with precise shots that suggested exceptional training. Then, still under fire, the figure began treating the wounded Marines with expert efficiency. That's Captain Mitchell, Callahan said quietly. Syria, 18 months ago. Those Marines never knew who saved them. She was maintaining deep cover and couldn't reveal herself. The camera angle shifted, and Derek could see one of the wounded Marines more clearly. His face was visible for just a moment before the rescuer helped load him into an evacuation vehicle. Derek's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the bunk, his world tilting on its axis. That's Timothy, my cousin Timothy, Rachel's little brother. Lance Corporal Timothy Blackwood, Callahan confirmed. Came home with stories about a guardian angel who appeared from nowhere. Said someone saved his whole squad and then vanished like smoke. She looked at Derek with something that might have been pity. Captain Mitchell knew who you were the moment you confronted her in the mess hall. She made the connection to your cousins. She could have destroyed you just by revealing that information. Could have told everyone in that room that you were attacking the person who saved your family. Derek's vision blurred with tears. Instead, she tried to de-escalate, gave me every chance to walk away. More than that, Callahan said, after you assaulted her, after you threw a punch at a superior officer who could have killed you without breaking a sweat, she advocated for your rehabilitation instead of court-martial. That kind of mercy? That's what real strength looks like, Sergeant Blackwood. The demotion stung, but not as much as the shame. Derek wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. You said I had a visitor? Colonel Harrigan. He says he has something to tell you about Captain Mitchell's father. Says you need to understand the legacy she's carrying. Callahan's expression softened slightly. Your rehabilitation starts tomorrow at 0400. It's going to be a hard year, Blackwood, but it's a year you'll spend learning instead of sitting in Leavenworth. Don't waste it. 6,000 miles away, Sara Mitchell lay prone on a rocky outcrop overlooking a fortified compound near Kermanshah, Iran. The position offered perfect sight lines to the target while keeping her silhouette below the ridgeline. She'd been motionless for 6 hours, despite the scorching heat that had to be pushing 42 degrees Celsius. A scorpion had investigated her leg an hour ago, crawling across her calf before determining she wasn't food or threat. She hadn't moved, couldn't afford to. Through her scope, she counted guards for the 100th time. 47 Iranian Revolutionary Guard soldiers, 3 Russian military advisors, identifiable by their different weapons and bearing. The compound consisted of 14 buildings arranged around a central courtyard, 3 guard towers providing overlapping fields of fire, perimeter wall 4 meters high topped with razor wire. Inside the eastern building, according to satellite thermal imaging, were 4 American prisoners. Captain James Randolph, Staff Sergeant Michael Thornton, Sergeant Sarah Gallagher, and Specialist David Pritchard. Army Rangers captured during a reconnaissance mission that officially never happened. The Iranian government was denying holding any Americans, which meant traditional diplomatic channels were useless. It also meant that if Sarah was captured, she would simply disappear. No one would come for her, no public outcry, no diplomatic pressure, just another missing person in a part of the world where people went missing all the time. Her earpiece crackled softly. Silent 7, this is Overwatch. Satellite confirmed 4 thermal signatures in Eastern Building. Guards change shift in 43 minutes. That's your window. Sarah clicked her microphone twice in acknowledgement, not trusting voice transmission, even on encrypted channels. 43 minutes to infiltrate a heavily guarded compound, locate and extract 4 prisoners who might be wounded or unable to move quickly, and get them to the extraction point 3 kilometers north. For most people, it would be impossible. For Silent 7, it was another mission. She adjusted her position minutely, her ghillie suit rustling with a sound like wind through grass. The suit had been constructed from local vegetation over the past 2 days, making her virtually invisible against the rocky hillside. Beneath it, she wore lightweight tactical gear in desert tan, chosen for mobility over protection. The plate carrier held only essential items, medical supplies, breaching charges, and ammunition. Her primary weapon was a suppressed .300 Winchester Magnum, custom-built for extreme range precision. Her secondary was a Glock 19 with integrated suppressor, chosen for reliability over everything else. The 43 minutes counted down in her head with the precision of an atomic clock. At 42 minutes, she memorized the patrol pattern one final time. At 40 minutes, she checked her equipment for the last time. At 38 minutes, she began her approach, moving with the patience of water wearing down stone. The infiltration was a masterpiece of tactical movement. Sara used every depression in the terrain, every shadow, every moment when the guards' attention was elsewhere. She covered 800 meters in 20 minutes without being detected, moving only when she had perfect concealment. The last 50 meters took another 10 minutes, glacial progress that put her against the compound's eastern wall exactly as the guard shift began to change. The compound's security cameras had blind spots, small gaps in coverage that existed in every system. Sara had identified them during her 6-hour observation. She moved through these dead spaces like a ghost, her movements fluid and silent. When she reached the base of the eastern building, she paused for 30 seconds, listening, breathing, becoming part of the structure itself. The breaching charge was thermite-based, designed to burn through the lock mechanism without the explosive signature of traditional charges. She placed it with surgical precision, set the timer for 5 seconds, and moved to the side. The burn was brilliant but brief, lasting less than 2 seconds. The lock mechanism melted into slag. Sara pushed the door open and went inside. The interior was dark, her eyes adjusting immediately after 6 hours in bright sunlight. 4 men were chained to the wall in the far corner, their conditions varying from bad to critical. Captain Randolph had taken shrapnel to his abdomen, the wound poorly bandaged and clearly infected. Staff Sergeant Thornton had a broken arm, set badly. Sergeant Gallagher looked mostly intact, but exhausted. Specialist Pritchard was conscious but weak. "I'm here to take you home," Sara said quietly, producing a small bolt cutter from her kit. "Stay quiet, stay close, do exactly what I say." Randolph's eyes widened as he recognized the accent. American. "Who are you?" "Nobody who was ever here," Sara replied, cutting through the first chain. "Can you walk?" "I can crawl if that's what it takes to get out of this place." She got all 4 men free in under 2 minutes, performing quick medical assessments as she worked. Randolph's wound was the concern. He was septic, fever burning through him. The others could move under their own power, though Thornton would need help. Then the alarm sounded, a wailing klaxon that shattered the night silence. Someone had discovered the breached door or noticed the missing guards. Either way, stealth was over. Now it was time for speed. "Move!" Sara commanded, pulling Randolph's arm across her shoulders, despite him outweighing her by 80 pounds. The 4 Rangers followed her out of the building and into chaos. Lights blazed on across the compound. Soldiers poured from barracks, grabbing weapons and body armor. Sara's tactical assessment was instantaneous. Primary exit blocked. Secondary exit blocked. Tertiary exit, the eastern wall, partially exposed but achievable. She shifted direction, half carrying Randolph while the others followed in a tight formation. A Russian advisor appeared from between buildings, bringing his AK-104 up to firing position. Sara's hand moved without conscious thought. 3 shots from her Glock, all center mass, less than half a second between them. The Russian dropped without getting off a round. The suppressor kept the shots quiet enough that they didn't register over the alarm's wail. They reached the eastern wall. Sara pulled a grappling hook from her kit, threw it to the top of the 4-meter barrier on her first try. "Climb," she ordered. "Thornton first, then Gallagher, then Pritchard." "What about you and the captain?" Gallagher asked. "We're right behind you. Move." As the 3 Rangers climbed, Sara provided covering fire. 2 guards appeared from the left. She dropped them both with precise shots that suggested years of practice under stress. 3 more from the right. She eliminated them with the same cold efficiency, her movements economical and lethal. Randolph was trying to climb one-handed, his other arm pressed against his wounded abdomen. He made it halfway up before his strength failed. Sara went up the rope behind him, boosting him with one hand while maintaining her grip with the other, her legs doing most of the work. They tumbled over the top together, landing in a heap on the far side. "Extract point is 3 kilometers north," she said, pulling Randolph up again. "We move fast and we move together. Anyone falls behind, we all fall behind. Clear?" "Clear," they responded in unison. The 3 kilometers became a nightmare run through darkness over rough terrain while carrying a wounded man. Sara called in the extraction on encrypted channels, painting the landing zone with an infrared strobe that only their pilots could see. Behind them, the Iranian compound had fully mobilized. Vehicles were starting to pursue, their headlights visible in the darkness. At 2 kilometers, Sara heard the distinctive sound of a helicopter approaching from the wrong direction. Iranian Huey, probably carrying a quick reaction force. She couldn't outrun it, couldn't hide from it. That left only one option. "Get down," she commanded, lowering Randolph behind a rock formation. She pulled the .300 Win Mag from her back, extended the bipod, and took a firing position. The helicopter was moving at about 120 kilometers per hour, at an altitude of roughly 400 meters. Distance to target, approximately 850 meters and closing. The ballistics calculation happened in her head faster than most people could read the numbers. Bullet drop at this distance with her load, 8.3 meters. Wind drift accounting for the 8-mile-per-hour crosswind, 0.6 meters left. Coriolis effect at this latitude and direction, 0.08 meters. Temperature compensation for the 38-degree heat, plus 2 clicks elevation. She adjusted the scope, controlled her breathing, and squeezed the trigger during the natural pause between heartbeats. The .300 Win Mag round traveled at over 900 meters per second, arriving at the helicopter before the sound of the shot. It punched through the windscreen and struck the pilot in the upper chest. The massive hydrostatic shock from the 220-grain bullet causing instant incapacitation. The helicopter's nose dipped, the aircraft beginning to spiral as the co-pilot fought for control. Sara fired again, second pilot down. The Huey went into an uncontrolled spin, crashing 200 meters from their position with a fireball that lit up the night sky. "Holy God," Thornton whispered. "Who are you?" "Someone who's very good at her job," Sara replied, already moving. "Now run." They reached the extraction point with 30 seconds to spare. The American helicopters came in fast and low, Apache gunships providing cover, while a Black Hawk touched down just long enough for the 5 of them to pile aboard. As they lifted off, Sara looked back at the burning Iranian compound, at the chaos they were leaving behind. "Silent 7, this is Overwatch. Package secured. 0 American casualties. Outstanding work." Sara keyed her mic. "Just doing what I was trained to do." Silent 7 returning to base. But as the helicopter raced toward the Iraqi border in safety, she felt the tremor in her hands that always came after. The adrenaline crash, the delayed fear response, the weight of having taken human lives, even in service of saving others. She'd killed 8 people tonight, maybe more in the helicopter. Each one had been necessary, each one had been justified, but each one would join the others in her dreams. Randolph was looking at her with undisguised awe. "We owe you our lives." "You don't owe me anything," Sara said quietly. "We don't leave people behind. That's the deal. That's always been the deal." 24 hours later, back at Camp Pendleton, Derek Blackwood stood in front of a room full of Marines for the first time since his arrest. This was the beginning of his rehabilitation, the first of 12 required speaking engagements where he would tell his story, tell the truth about his prejudice and his transformation. His hands were shaking as he gripped the podium. No longer staff sergeant, just sergeant now, the reduction in rank a constant reminder of his failure. But Hawk Harrigan sat in the back row, his presence somehow steadying. The old colonel had spent 2 hours yesterday telling Derek about John Mitchell, about Desert Storm, about a father who had died, proving that courage and capability had nothing to do with gender. "My name is Sergeant Derek Blackwood," he began, his voice rough but clear. "3 days ago, I attacked a fellow service member because I believed women didn't belong in the military. I was wrong. Not just tactically wrong or procedurally wrong, fundamentally, morally wrong. I'm here to tell you about that day. about what I learned, and about why everything I believed about strength and capability was based on ignorance and prejudice. The room was silent as he told the story. He didn't minimize his actions or make excuses. He talked about the harassment, the escalation, the moment when he threw a punch at someone who had shown him nothing but professional courtesy. He talked about discovering that his victim was actually a decorated special operator who could have killed him but chose not to. And he talked about learning that Captain Sara Mitchell had saved both his cousins, Rachel and Helman, and Timothy in Syria, without ever seeking recognition or reward. Captain Mitchell taught me something that day, Derek concluded, his voice breaking slightly, that real warriors prove themselves through actions, not words. They do their jobs, save lives, complete their missions, and move on to the next challenge without asking for praise or recognition. He paused, looking around the room at faces both sympathetic and skeptical. I'm spending the next year learning to be the kind of Marine my cousins could be proud of, the kind who judges people by their actions rather than their appearance, the kind who understands that strength comes in forms I never expected. His eyes found Hawk in the back row. The kind of Marine that Captain Mitchell's father died proving we could all be, if we just had the courage to let go of our prejudices and see people for who they really are. When the presentation ended, Hawk approached him quietly. That was a good start, son. First step of a long journey. Colonel, can I ask you something? Derek's voice was hesitant. Why did she save me? After everything I did, everything I said, she had every right to end my career. Why show mercy? Hawk was quiet for a moment, considering. I think because she understands something you're just learning. That people can change. That mistakes don't have to define us. That redemption is possible if we're willing to do the work. He put a hand on Derek's shoulder. Her father believed in second chances, in the fundamental goodness of people, even when they failed to see it themselves. She inherited that belief, along with his skill. I want to be better, Derek said quietly. I want to become someone worthy of the second chance she gave me. Then do the work, Hawk replied simply. Every day, every interaction, every moment you're tempted to fall back into old patterns. Do the work of becoming better. That's all any of us can do. 2 weeks later, Sara Mitchell stood in Colonel Harper's office, her arm in a proper sling now that she no longer needed to maintain her cover. The knife wound from the Russian advisor in Kermanshah had required stitches and would leave a scar to join all the others. Physical therapy said 3 weeks until full mobility return. Your counterintelligence operation was a complete success, Harper said, reviewing the file on his desk. The 3 contractors are cooperating fully. The intelligence they provided has already led to arrests in 3 other locations. You've potentially saved hundreds of lives by plugging this leak. Thank you, sir. And the Iran extraction, 4 Rangers home safely, 0 American casualties. The kind of mission that would earn medals if anyone could acknowledge it happened. He looked up at her. How's your arm? Healing, sir. I'll be operational again in 3 weeks. Harper nodded, then slid another folder across the desk. I have something to propose. Something that might interest you more than your next mission. Sara opened the folder and read quickly, her eyebrows rising. A training program? For female Marines interested in special operations? Project Sentinel, Harper confirmed. Admiral Sutherland approved it at the highest levels. You'd run the program, identify candidates, put them through a preparatory course that gets them ready for actual SEAL or Delta selection. Show them what's possible. Show the entire military what's possible. Sir, I'm an operator. I go into the field. I complete missions. Training is important, Harper interrupted. Maybe more important than another mission. You proved something 3 days ago in that mess hall. You showed 200 Marines that their assumptions about capability were wrong. That demonstration is already changing minds across this base. Imagine what you could do with a year, with a proper program, with hand-picked candidates. Sara looked at the proposal, her tactical mind already assessing it like a mission. I'd need a co-instructor, someone with experience and credibility, someone who can reach the male Marines who still have doubts. Already arranged, Harper said with a slight smile. Colonel Harrigan has volunteered, says he's got a few good years left in him, and he'd like to spend them passing on what he knows. Sara felt something warm bloom in her chest. Hawk had volunteered. The man who'd served with her father, who'd recognized her immediately, who represented everything about the old guard that was worth preserving. Having him as a partner would send a message that this wasn't about replacing traditional values. It was about honoring them by expanding who could embody them. When do we start? She asked. First class begins in 2 weeks. We've already identified 8 candidates. Lance Corporal Ember Reeves is at the top of the list, 24 years old, exceptional PT scores, perfect discipline record, served in Afghanistan. She was in the mess hall that morning, saw everything. Sara nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. This was how you changed culture. Not with regulations or PowerPoint presentations, but by showing people what was possible, by proving that the standards could be met by anyone with the skill and determination to meet them, by creating a new generation of warriors who would carry these truths forward. I'll do it, she said. Project Sentinel. Let's show them what the future looks like. As she left Harper's office, Sara found Hawk waiting in the hallway. The old colonel fell into step beside her without speaking, their footsteps echoing in sync down the corridor. You told Blackwood about my father, Sara said quietly. He needed to understand the legacy you're carrying, needed to see that this isn't about politics or social engineering. It's about honoring the warriors who came before by being worthy of their sacrifice. They walked in silence for a moment before Sara spoke again. Thank you for delivering his message, for keeping his memory alive, for volunteering to help with this insane training program. Hawk's face creased with what might have been a smile. Your father would be proud of you, Sara, not just for your missions, not just for your skills, but for choosing mercy when you could have chosen revenge, for seeing potential in those 5 Marines when everyone else saw only prejudice. That's the hardest kind of strength, the kind that changes the world. I learned from the best, Sara replied softly, touching the pocket where she kept her father's journal. Yes, Hawk agreed. You did. 1 year later, the morning sun painted Camp Pendleton's parade ground in shades of gold and amber, the kind of light that made everything look like it belonged in a recruiting poster. 5 women stood at attention in their dress uniforms, ribbons on their chests telling stories of hard-won achievement. Behind them, a crowd of several hundred Marines, officers, and civilians had gathered to witness something that would have been unthinkable just 12 months ago. Project Sentinel's first graduating class. Admiral William Sutherland stood at the podium, his service dress blues immaculate, his bearing that of a man who had spent 30 years earning the right to make pronouncements about military excellence. Behind him, a banner displayed the Project Sentinel logo, a female warrior in silhouette, head high, rifle ready, with the motto, Strength through Silence, beneath. Sara Mitchell stood to the Admiral's left, her own dress uniform displaying ribbons that most people in attendance couldn't begin to interpret. The Navy Cross she'd received for Syria remained classified, its citation locked away for another 49 years. The Bronze Star with Valor from Iraq, the Purple Heart from Yemen. Each ribbon represented a story that would never be told, a mission that officially never happened, lives saved that would never be counted in any official record. To the Admiral's right stood Colonel James Harrigan, looking uncomfortable in his dress blues for only the second time in 40 years of retirement. At 73, his back was still straight, his eyes still sharp, his presence still commanding respect from Marines a third his age. The past year of instruction had been good for him, giving him purpose beyond sitting in an empty house remembering Korea. These 5 Marines, Sutherland began, his voice carrying across the parade ground without electronic amplification. have proven that capability knows no gender. They have met and exceeded every standard placed before them. They have overcome obstacles, both physical and cultural. They have demonstrated the warrior spirit that defines our special operations community. Sarah's eyes tracked across the 5 graduates. Lance Corporal Ember Reeves stood at the center, her auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her green eyes fixed forward with the intensity of someone who had just spent 12 months being forged in fire. To her left stood Corporal Madison Cross, a 26-year-old from Montana who could shoot the wings off a fly at 1,000 meters. To her right, Sergeant Bailey Frost, 28, who had completed the Marine Corps Marathon carrying an 80-pound ruck without falling behind the male leaders. The other 2 graduates, Corporal Alexis Rivers and Lance Corporal Jordan Quinn, stood at the ends of the formation. All 5 had started as part of an 8-woman class. 3 had dropped out, unable to meet the standards that were applied with brutal equality. No concessions, no lowered bars, the same requirements that male special operations candidates faced, adjusted only where physiology demanded different paths to identical outcomes. They represent the future of American military power, Sutherland continued, diverse, capable, and absolutely lethal when necessary. It is my honor to recognize their achievement and to announce that Lance Corporal Ember Reeves has been selected to attend Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL Training, Class 357, beginning in 3 weeks. The crowd erupted in applause. Several female Marines in attendance had tears streaming down their faces. Ember's mother, sitting in the front row, pressed a handkerchief to her eyes, while her father stood and clapped until his palms turned red. Sarah stepped forward, carrying a wooden box lined with velvet. Inside were 5 challenge coins, each one custom-made for this moment. She approached Ember first, removing 1 coin and placing it in the young woman's palm. "Strength through silence," Sarah said quietly, the words meant for Ember alone. "You've earned this. Your real journey starts now." Ember's fingers closed around the coin. On one side was the Sentinel logo. On the other, 3 words in simple script. Be silent, deadly. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized the phrase. Sarah's father's last words, now passed to the next generation. "I won't let you down, ma'am," Ember whispered. "I know you won't. You're going to make me look bad by being better than I ever was." Sarah moved down the line, presenting each coin with words tailored to each woman. Madison received hers with a sniper's stillness, barely breathing. Bailey took hers with hands that had hauled 200 pounds of gear up mountains without complaint. Alexis and Jordan each received theirs with the quiet pride of women who had proven something to themselves more than to anyone watching. When the ceremony concluded, the crowd began to disperse, but Sarah noticed Derek Blackwood standing near the back, wearing the staff sergeant insignia he just earned back 2 weeks ago. His year of rehabilitation was complete. His transformation from antagonist to advocate had been thorough enough that Admiral Sutherland himself had approved the rank restoration. Derek approached slowly, respectfully waiting for Sarah to acknowledge him. When she did, he came to attention and saluted with crisp precision. "Captain Mitchell, permission to speak?" "Granted, Staff Sergeant." "My cousin Rachel, Corporal Rachel Blackwood. She's retiring from active duty next month." Derek's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the emotion underneath. "She wants to join Project Sentinel as an instructor. Senior instructor if you'll have her. She says it's time to give back. Time to help create the next generation." Sarah felt something warm settle in her chest. Rachel Blackwood, the woman she'd provided Overwatch for in Helmand without ever revealing herself. The woman whose story had helped Derek understand his own prejudice. Having her join Sentinel would complete a circle that had started long before that morning in the mess hall. "I'd be honored to have her," Sarah said. "Tell her to report in 2 weeks. We'll need her expertise for the 2nd class." "Thank you, ma'am." Derek hesitated, then continued. "I'd also like to volunteer. Not as an instructor. I know I'm not qualified for that, but as support staff, whatever you need, equipment maintenance, logistics, administrative work. I want to help ensure that the women in this program have everything they need to succeed. It's a small way to make amends for my previous attitudes. Sara studied him for a long moment. The man standing before her bore little resemblance to the prejudiced Marine who had harassed her 12 months ago. That Derek had been angry, insecure, threatened by anything that challenged his worldview. This Derek stood with quiet confidence, secure enough in himself to support others without feeling diminished. "We could use someone with your organizational skills," Sara said. "Report to Colonel Harrigan on Monday. He'll assign your duties." Derek's face lit up with gratitude. "I won't let you down, Captain." "I know you won't, Staff Sergeant. You've already proven that." As Derek walked away, Hawk appeared at Sara's elbow, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent a lifetime approaching without being noticed. "That was well done," the old colonel said, giving him purpose, letting him contribute to something larger than his own redemption. "He's earned it. They all have. Jamie Thorne is teaching integrated combat techniques. Rhett Sullivan published his book last month. Marcus Donovan's fitness protocols are being adopted across the Corps. Even young Wyatt Brennan is making a difference as a leadership instructor." Sara paused, watching the 5 graduates pose for photos with their families. "Turns out people can change if you give them the chance and the motivation." "Your father believed that," Hawk said quietly. "He used to say that the difference between a good leader and a great one was knowing when to destroy and when to build. You destroyed their prejudices in that mess hall, then you built them into better men. That's leadership." Before Sara could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced at the screen and her expression shifted slightly. Hawk, who had learned to read her micro-expressions over the past year, recognized the change immediately. "New orders? Encrypted message. I need to check it in a secure location." She looked at him with something that might have been regret. "This might be the call, the one that takes me away from Sentinel." "You knew it was coming. Operators like you don't stay in one place forever. The world keeps producing problems that need your particular skill set." Hawk's hand gripped her shoulder briefly. "Go read your message. I'll handle the after-ceremony reception. Give your speech later if you're still here." Sara nodded and made her way to the secure communications facility, a nondescript building that housed classified equipment behind multiple layers of security. Inside a sealed room, she entered her credentials and opened the message. The words on the screen were brief but clear. "Broken Arrow, North Korea. 12 Americans detained. Accusations of espionage. Execution scheduled 72 hours. Immediate deployment required. Authorization code follows." Sara read the authorization code and felt ice settle in her stomach. This was a Phantom Protocol mission, the highest level of black operations, the kind that required absolute deniability. If she was captured, the United States government would disavow all knowledge. She would simply disappear, another missing person in a country that made people disappear regularly. She pulled up the mission brief. 12 aid workers from a Christian humanitarian organization had been operating in North Korea under official permits, delivering medical supplies and agricultural training. Someone had planted classified documents in their facility. Now the North Korean government was holding them as spies, planning a very public execution to demonstrate their sovereignty and strength. Intelligence suggested the prisoners were being held in a facility outside Pyongyang. Details were scarce. Satellite imagery showed a compound with significant security. No other intelligence assets were in position to verify prisoner, location, or condition. The mission would require insertion, confirmation, extraction, and exfiltration, all within the 72-hour window. Sara studied the brief for 20 minutes, her tactical mind already working through the problems. This wasn't like Iran. North Korea had more sophisticated security, better trained soldiers, and a government paranoid enough to shoot first and investigate never. The risk level was catastrophic. The probability of success was marginal at best. But 12 Americans were counting on someone to come for them, even if they didn't know it yet. She typed a response. Mission accepted. Require 48 hours preparation. Will advise when in position. The reply came back instantly. Approved. Assets being positioned. Transport leaves at 2200 hours. Sara closed the secure terminal and sat in the silence of the communications room for a long moment. 48 hours until she would be in North Korea, attempting something that the entire intelligence community had assessed as nearly impossible. She had gone into dangerous situations before, had faced terrible odds and prevailed through skill and determination, and sometimes just blind luck. But this felt different. This felt like the kind of mission you didn't necessarily come back from. She thought about her father, holding that position in Iraq for 17 minutes while Hayes escaped. 11 bullets, any one of them fatal, but he kept fighting until his mission was complete, until the person he was protecting was safe. That was the legacy she carried, the standard she measured herself against. The door opened and Hawk entered, his security clearance high enough to access this facility despite his retirement status. He looked at her face and understood immediately. How bad? Bad enough that I might not make it back for the second Sentinel class. Hawk nodded slowly. Can you tell me where? No. Can you tell me when? I leave tonight. The old colonel was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he moved to the secure terminal and typed in his own credentials, pulling up information that made Sara's eyebrows rise. His clearance was higher than she'd realized, granting access to operational details that should have been sealed. North Korea, he said, reading the brief. 12 prisoners, minimal intelligence, catastrophic risk level. He looked at her with those pale blue eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. You're going alone. That's the mission profile. Single operator, complete deniability. Your father went alone too at first, but he trusted his team enough to bring support when it mattered. Hawk's voice was gentle, but firm. You've spent a year learning to build a team, learning to trust. Don't abandon that lesson now. Hawk, this is North Korea. I can't risk. Ember Reeves graduates BUD/S in 3 weeks. Hawk interrupted. But she's already completed basic SEAL training equivalents through Sentinel. She's jump qualified. She's combat qualified. She's as ready as she's ever going to be. Sara shook her head. She's not experienced enough for something like this. This is a suicide mission dressed up as a rescue operation. So was Iraq in 1991. So was Iran 6 months ago. So is every mission that matters. Hawk pulled up Ember's training records on the terminal. Look at her scores, her evaluations. The woman can shoot, move, and communicate at a level that would qualify her for any special operations unit. What she lacks is field experience, and she'll never get that experience if someone doesn't give her the chance. Sara studied the records, her analytical mind warring with her protective instincts. Ember was exceptional, no question. Her marksmanship scores rivaled Sara's own. Her tactical thinking showed creativity and adaptability. Her physical conditioning was off the charts. But there was a difference between training and reality, between simulated stress and actual combat where people died if you made mistakes. If I take her and she gets killed, that's on me, Sara said quietly. If you don't take her and you get killed, Project Sentinel dies with you, Hawk countered. Right now, you're the only proof that this works, the only example these women can point to. But if Ember completes a mission like this, if she proves herself in the worst possible conditions, then the program survives regardless of what happens to you. The logic was sound, even if Sara hated it. She was thinking tactically when she needed to think strategically. One mission versus the future of female special operations. Her survival versus the demonstration that these women could do anything their male counterparts could do. I'll ask her, Sara said finally, but the choice has to be hers. She needs to understand the risk. Fair enough, Hawk agreed, though something tells me she'll jump at the chance. 2 hours later, Sara found Ember on the rifle range, methodically working through drills with her primary weapon. The young woman's form was textbook perfect, her breathing controlled, her follow-through smooth. She didn't notice Sarah's approach until the magazine was empty and the weapon safe. "Congratulations again on your selection," Sara said. "Bud/S is going to be challenging, but I have no doubt you'll excel." "Thank you, ma'am. I'll do my best to represent Sentinel well." "I know you will." Sara paused, choosing her words carefully. "I have a question for you, Lance Corporal, and I need you to think very carefully before answering." Ember set her rifle down and gave Sara her full attention. "Yes, ma'am." "How would you feel about delaying BUD/S by a few weeks? There's an operational mission that requires a two-person team. High risk, minimal support, the kind of thing that could end very badly if anything goes wrong." Sara held Ember's gaze. "I can't tell you where or what the objective is unless you agree, but I can tell you that 12 Americans are depending on someone to come for them, and I could use a partner I trust." Ember's eyes widened slightly, processing what was being offered. This wasn't a training exercise. This wasn't a simulation. This was Captain Sara Mitchell, legendary operator, asking her to go into combat on a real mission. The kind of opportunity that most special operations candidates spent years hoping for. "When do we leave?" Ember asked without hesitation. Sara felt a smile tug at the corner of her mouth. "Tonight at 2200 hours, we'll brief on the aircraft. Pack light, pack smart, and say your goodbyes without telling anyone where you're going." "Yes, ma'am, I'll be ready." As Ember gathered her equipment, Sara watched the young woman move with confidence and purpose. She saw echoes of herself at that age, hungry for the chance to prove herself, ready to face any challenge. But she also saw something else, something that gave her hope for the future. Ember moved like she belonged, like there was no question in her mind that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. That kind of certainty was rare. That kind of confidence was earned. And that kind of warrior was exactly what America needed. At 2200 hours, an unmarked aircraft sat on a restricted section of the airfield, its engines already running. Sara and Ember approached in civilian clothes, carrying small, tactical bags that contained everything they would need for the next 72 hours. At the stairs, Admiral Sutherland waited, his expression grave. "Captain Mitchell, Lance Corporal Reeves." He handed Sara a sealed folder. "Your final briefing materials, authorization codes, extraction protocols." He paused, then extended his hand. "Bring them home, all of them." Sara shook his hand firmly. "That's the mission, sir." As they climbed the stairs, Sara noticed Hawk standing near the aircraft's tail, his silhouette backlit by the harsh lights of the airfield. She detoured toward him, Ember following respectfully behind. "Came to see us off?" Sara asked. "Came to tell you something your father told me, the night before that mission in Iraq." Hawk's voice was rough with emotion. "He said that fear keeps you sharp, but courage keeps you moving forward. Feel the fear, acknowledge it, then do the job anyway, because that's what warriors do." "I'll remember that. And one more thing." Hawk pulled something from his pocket. A small medallion on a chain, worn smooth with age and handling. "Your father gave this to me before that final mission. Said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you when you were old enough to understand what it meant. I think that time is now." Sara took the medallion, her fingers tracing the inscription. "Strength, honor, sacrifice, the 3 pillars of service," Hawk said. "He lived them, died for them. Now you carry them forward, both of you." He looked at Ember directly. "Take care of each other out there. Watch each other's backs. Your father would want you both to come home safe." "Yes, sir," Ember said, the weight of that responsibility settling on her shoulders like armor. Sara embraced Hawk briefly, the gesture awkward but genuine. "Thank you. For everything. for delivering his message, for training with Sentinel, for believing this could work. Thank you for proving an old Marine's faith wasn't misplaced. Hawk stepped back, coming to attention and rendering a perfect salute. Warriors like you don't come along often, Captain. Make it count. Sara returned the salute and boarded the aircraft with Ember close behind. As the plane taxied toward the runway, she pulled out the mission brief and began her final review. Ember sat across from her, absorbing every detail with the focus of someone who understood that information was survival. Your first question? Sara asked, remembering Hawk's advice about fear. Ember met her eyes steadily. Will I be afraid? Yes, fear keeps you sharp. It's your body's way of making sure you pay attention to details that could save your life. Sara paused, letting that sink in. But you'll do the job anyway. That's what makes you a warrior, not the absence of fear, the ability to function despite it. The aircraft lifted off, climbing into the night sky above California. Below them, Camp Pendleton grew smaller, the lights of the base fading into the darkness. Somewhere down there, Project Sentinel would continue. The second class would begin in 2 weeks. Rachel Blackwood would join as an instructor. Derek and the others would provide support. The work would go on regardless of what happened in North Korea. But Sara and Ember carried the immediate responsibility. 12 lives depending on their skill and courage. A mission that would either cement the future of female special operations or end it in a North Korean prison. Sara looked across at Ember, seeing the mix of fear and determination in the young woman's eyes. She remembered feeling exactly the same way before her first real mission. The uncertainty, the awareness of mortality, the knowledge that everything could go wrong in an instant. Tell me about your family, Sara said quietly, breaking the tactical briefing for a moment of humanity. My mother's a teacher. My father's a mechanic. I have 2 younger brothers still in high school. Ember's voice was soft, but steady. They don't really understand what I do, why I chose this. My mom cries every time I deploy. Mine did too, Sara said. Until the day she died, she never stopped worrying, but she also never stopped being proud. Your mother understands more than you think. She knows you're doing something that matters. They sat in silence for a while, the aircraft carrying them toward a destination neither could name, a mission that would test everything they had learned. Outside the window, stars blazed in a sky unmarred by city lights, the same stars that soldiers had navigated by for thousands of years, the same stars that would shine regardless of whether this mission succeeded or failed. Sara touched the medallion Hawk had given her, feeling the weight of her father's legacy. Strength, honor, sacrifice. 3 words that defined a life of service. 3 principles that turned ordinary people into warriors. She looked at Ember again and saw the future. Saw a generation of women who would carry these principles forward, who would prove through action rather than argument that capability knew no gender, who would earn their place not through lowered standards, but through meeting the same challenges as everyone else. We're going to make it back, Sara said with quiet conviction. We're going to complete this mission, extract those prisoners, and get home in time for you to start BUD/S. And when you graduate, when you earn your trident, you're going to be proof that everything we've built with Sentinel works, that the standards can be met, that the future of special operations includes warriors like you. Ember nodded, her jaw set with determination. Yes, ma'am, I won't let you down. I know you won't. You're going to make me look bad by being better than I ever was. The North Korea mission unfolded over the next 60 hours with the precision of a surgical strike. Sara and Ember infiltrated the compound outside Pyongyang, using techniques that blended Hawk's Korea-era tradecraft with modern technology. The 12 aid workers were held in worse conditions than the Iranian Rangers, malnourished and psychologically broken, but alive. The extraction required every ounce of Sara's experience and Ember's adaptability. When their primary exfiltration route was compromised, Ember's quick thinking identified an alternative that Sara had dismissed as too risky. The young Marine was right. They moved all 12 prisoners through a drainage tunnel that Sara's conservative assessment had marked as impassable. Ember's smaller frame allowed her to scout it first, confirming it was viable. 0 casualties, 12 Americans home, and Ember Reeves had her first combat mission in the books. 10 days after the aircraft disappeared into the darkness above California, a secure message arrived at Camp Pendleton. Hawk Harrigan was the only person cleared to read it. Phantom protocol complete. 12 packages extracted. 0 casualties. Silent 7 in Sentinel 1 returning stateside. Hawk closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, a prayer of thanks to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. John Mitchell's daughter had done it again, and she'd brought her protege home alive. 3 weeks later, Coronado Beach blazed under the California sun as Bud's Class 357 completed Hell Week. 140 candidates had started, 32 remained. Among them, stumbling out of the surf with legs that barely worked and eyes that had forgotten what sleep felt like, was Lance Corporal Ember Reeves. She collapsed onto the sand, every muscle screaming, every joint on fire. But she was smiling, because standing at the edge of the beach, in civilian clothes, was Captain Sara Mitchell. Sara walked over and looked down at the exhausted young woman. "Not bad, Reeves. Thought North Korea might have slowed you down." Ember laughed, the sound half sob, half triumph. "You told me we'd make it back in time, ma'am. I wasn't about to make you a liar." "Smart choice." Sara extended her hand and pulled Ember to her feet. "Welcome to the community. Your Trident ceremony is in 6 months. I'll be there." "What about the 12 people in North Korea?" Ember asked quietly. "Home safe, all of them. Thanks to you," Sara's voice dropped. "You did good work, Reeves. Your first mission, and you performed like a veteran. Project Sentinel has its proof now. You're the proof." 6 months later, Sara stood in the audience as Ember Reeves received her Navy SEAL Trident, the first female graduate of Project Sentinel to earn it. The ceremony was small, classified, attended only by those with need-to-know clearance. But it marked a watershed moment. The second Sentinel class had graduated 3 months prior, with 4 women selected for various special operations pipelines. Rachel Blackwood was proving to be an exceptional instructor, her helmed experience giving her credibility that even the most skeptical male Marines couldn't dismiss. Derek Blackwood had become the program's backbone, ensuring every piece of equipment was maintained to perfection, every administrative detail handled flawlessly. His transformation was complete. The man who had once attacked Sara in a mess hall now dedicated his career to ensuring female warriors had every tool they needed to succeed. 10 years later, a young female private stood in Camp Pendleton's mess hall, frozen as a male lance corporal sneered at her. "Women don't belong." "Finish that sentence, Marine." The voice cut through the room like a blade. The lance corporal turned and found himself staring at Major Ember Reeves, commander of Project Sentinel. Her uniform displayed a Navy SEAL Trident, a bronze star, 2 Purple Hearts, and ribbons he couldn't even identify. At 34, she had completed 42 combat missions and trained 3 more classes of female special operators. "Ma'am, you didn't think. Just like 5 Marines didn't think 10 years ago." Ember's green eyes were hard as granite. "Sit down. Let me tell you a story about a mess hall, a warrior named Sara Mitchell, and the day everything changed." The young female private straightened, hope dawning in her eyes as she realized she wasn't alone. Around the mess hall, a dozen other female Marines watched, many of them Sentinel graduates or candidates. The program had expanded beyond the Marine Corps. The Army had launched Project Athena. The Air Force had Project Valkyrie, each inspired by what Sara Mitchell had started. Ember spent the next 30 minutes telling the story, not sparing Derek's actions or his redemption. The lance corporal who'd made the comment sat pale-faced, realizing how close he'd come to repeating history. That Marine, Derek Blackwood, is now a master sergeant, Ember concluded. He runs logistics for every female special operations program across all service branches. He turned his greatest failure into his life's purpose. You can do the same. Or you can double down on ignorance. Your choice. After the crowd dispersed, the young private approached Ember hesitantly. Ma'am, is she still operational? Ember's expression softened slightly. Captain Mitchell retired from field operations 5 years ago. She's now a colonel, overseeing all special operations integration programs. She trains the trainers, advises the Joint Chiefs, and every female operator in the U.S. military owes her a debt they can never repay. Does she ever come back to Camp Pendleton? Once a year, for Sentinel graduations. Ember paused, then added, she'll be here next month. If you're serious about this life, I can arrange for you to meet her. The young woman's eyes went wide. I would be honored, ma'am. Then work hard, prove you deserve it, and remember, Ember's voice took on the cadence of a lesson repeated many times. Strength through silence. That's not just a motto, it's a way of life. Real warriors prove themselves through actions, not words. They do their jobs, save lives, complete their missions, and they move on to the next challenge without asking for praise. 1 month later, Colonel Sara Mitchell stood on the same parade ground where she'd presented challenge coins to the first Sentinel class 11 years ago. Her hair was touched with gray now, her face carrying lines that spoke of hard decisions and harder missions. But her eyes were still the same blue, still sharp, still missing nothing. Hawk Harrigan sat in the front row, in a wheelchair now, at 83, but his mind was still sharp. Derek Blackwood, now a master sergeant, stood at attention nearby, his life's work evident in the flawless organization of the ceremony. 20 women graduated that day, Project Sentinel's 12th class. Among them were the daughters of Marines who'd witnessed that confrontation in the mess hall 11 years ago. Young women who'd grown up hearing the story of the small blonde warrior who changed everything. After the ceremony, Sara walked among the graduates, shaking hands, offering quiet words of encouragement. Each one received a challenge coin. Each one heard the same words. Strength through silence. Your journey starts now. When she reached the last graduate, Sara paused. The young woman looked familiar somehow. Your name, Marine? Private First Class Jessica Blackwood, ma'am. Derek Blackwood is my father. Sara's eyebrows rose slightly. Derek had never mentioned having a daughter. She glanced over at the master sergeant, who stood watching with undisguised pride and something that might have been tears in his eyes. Your father told you the story? Sara asked. Every year on the anniversary, ma'am, he said he never wanted me to forget that people can change, that mistakes don't define us, and that the strongest people are often the ones we underestimate. Jessica's voice was steady. He also said that you showed him more about real strength in one morning than he'd learned in 20 years of service. Sara felt something warm bloom in her chest. She looked at Derek, who nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth of his daughter's words. Your father learned one of life's hardest lessons, Sara said to Jessica, and instead of letting it destroy him, he let it transform him. That takes a special kind of courage. She pressed the challenge coin into Jessica's palm. Carry that forward. Be better than we were. Build on what we've started. Yes, ma'am, I will. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, Sara found herself alone with Hawk. The old colonel looked up at her from his wheelchair, his pale eyes still sharp despite his age. Your father would be proud, Hawk said quietly, not just of what you've accomplished, but of what you've built, the legacy you've created. We built it together, Sara replied. You, me, Derek, Ember, Rachel, all of those women who refused to quit when everyone said it was impossible. Maybe, Hawk allowed. But you were the catalyst, the proof that it could be done. Everything else followed from that morning in the mess hall, when you chose competence over ego, mercy over revenge, building over destroying. Sara knelt beside the wheelchair so she was at eye level with him. Thank you, Hawk, for delivering my father's message, for training the next generation, for believing when nobody else did. Thank your father, Hawk said. I'm just keeping a promise I made 33 years ago, to make sure his daughter knew what he died proving, that real warriors come in all forms, and the deadliest ones are often the ones nobody sees coming. He pulled something from his pocket, a faded photograph, edges worn soft with handling. It showed a young Delta operator in desert camouflage, grinning at the camera. Captain John Mitchell, 1991, Iraq. He carried this picture of you, Hawk said, pressing it into Sara's hands. Kept it in his helmet. It was with him when he died. I've carried it ever since, waiting for the right time to give it to you. Sara looked at the photograph, her father's face young and alive, frozen in a moment before sacrifice, before heroism, before his last stand that had defined her entire life. Her vision blurred with tears she didn't try to hide. Be strong, be silent, be deadly, she whispered. Her father's last words a benediction and a mission statement. You've been all three, Hawk said, and you've taught a whole generation to do the same. That's a legacy worth more than any medal, any rank, any recognition. The sun was setting over Camp Pendleton as Sara stood, the photograph clutched in her hand. Somewhere on the base, 20 new Sentinel graduates were celebrating with their families, dreaming of missions they'd complete, lives they'd save, barriers they'd break. Somewhere, a young private named Jessica Blackwood was calling her father, thanking him for showing her what real strength looked like. And somewhere in the darkness, the next generation of silent operators was preparing for missions that didn't officially exist, to save lives that wouldn't be counted, proving once again that warriors came in every form. The legacy continued. The torch burned bright, and the silent operators would endure, generation after generation, demonstrating through action rather than words that capability knew no gender, that courage required no specific form, and that the strongest warriors were often the ones nobody expected. Strength through silence. 3 simple words that had changed the world, one mission at a time.